A heart that learns to feel again is the most dangerous thing in the world. They had said Clara Bennett was foolish for refusing a man who could have saved her future, their whispers trailing her like cold smoke as she stood beneath the cathedral lights, her gloved hands steady even as her world quietly collapsed. And when she walked away that morning without looking back, she did not return to London society. She vanished instead into the northern countryside where the air cut sharp and clean, and mercy was not something easily found. And that was how she arrived at Whitmore Manor, a place spoken of in low voices, where the windows were always dim and the halls carried a silence that seemed older than the stone itself, and where the Duke rarely allowed anyone close enough to see him clearly. Yet from the very first evening, he saw her, not the polished composure she wore like armor, but the fracture beneath it. The way her fingers tightened just slightly when footsteps echoed too near. The way her gaze never lingered on any man longer than a breath, as if even looking too long might invite something she could not afford to feel. And when she finally noticed him standing across the grand hall, tall and still as though carved from shadow, her chin lifted a fraction higher, her voice calm but distant as she said, "Your Grace," before turning away without waiting for acknowledgement. And that should have been the end of it. Another servant keeping her place. Another silent figure moving through his home unnoticed. But it was not, because Alexander Whitmore did not look away, because something in her quiet defiance, in the way she refused to soften or please or even fear him, unsettled a part of him long buried beneath years of deliberate solitude. And so the next morning, when she stepped into the frost-covered garden expecting emptiness, she found him already there, standing just close enough that the air between them felt altered, charged with something neither of them named. And her breath caught for the briefest second before she forced it steady, her voice lower now, sharper, "You should not be here." And his response came without hesitation, quiet, controlled. "This is my home." Yet he did not move closer, did not reach for her, did not demand anything at all. He simply remained. And it was that, more than any command or intrusion, that unsettled her most, because she had built her world on distance, on rules that kept everything predictable, safe, untouched. And yet here stood a man who broke none of them and still refused to leave. And as she turned away, walking back toward the stone walls that had begun to feel like shelter, she felt it for the first time in years, not fear, not anger, but something far more dangerous, the faint, unwanted awareness that no matter how carefully she guarded her heart, someone had already stepped close enough to see it, and had chosen, without permission, to stay. Clara learned quickly that silence in Whitmore Manor was not empty but watchful, as if the walls themselves listened, and no matter how carefully she kept her distance, she could feel it, the quiet awareness of his presence lingering at the edge of every room she entered, never intruding, never speaking more than necessary, yet never entirely absent either. And it unsettled her in ways she refused to name, because this was not how danger had felt before. There were no raised voices, no demands, no expectations pressed upon her. Only a man who existed too steadily within her carefully controlled world. And that steadiness made it harder to breathe than any chaos ever had. So she adjusted, as she always did, rising earlier, moving faster, choosing corridors that avoided the main halls, keeping her gaze lowered when footsteps echoed behind her, until one evening the storm came in from the north, sharp winds rattling the tall windows as the house dimmed under heavy clouds, and she found herself alone in the east wing, sorting ledgers by candlelight when the flame flickered violently, casting shadows that stretched too long across the walls. And for a moment, just a moment, her hand stilled, her breath catching as something unseen pressed against her memory, something she had buried beneath years of discipline. And the room felt smaller, the air thinner, until she closed her eyes and forced it away, straightening her spine, steadying her hands, reminding herself that she was no longer that girl, that nothing here could touch her. And yet when she turned, he was there, standing in the doorway as though he had always been part of the shadows, his presence quiet but undeniable, and her heart betrayed her with a sudden, sharp rhythm before she forced it back into silence, her voice calm but colder now. "You should not be here." And again, he did not move closer, did not cross the invisible line she had drawn, but neither did he leave. his gaze steady on her, not searching, not questioning, simply present. And it was that presence that broke something fragile in the air between them, because he did not look at her the way others once had, not with expectation or judgment or careless curiosity, but as if he already understood the cost of whatever she was holding back, and that understanding felt too close, too dangerous. And she turned away sharply, gripping the edge of the table as if it were something solid enough to anchor her, her voice lower, controlled. "Do not make a habit of this, Your Grace." And for the first time, there was the faintest shift in him, something almost imperceptible, as though her words had not pushed him away but simply settled somewhere he had already considered. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "You are the one who came into my house." And the words should have sounded like authority, like a reminder of place, but they did not. They carried no weight of command, only truth, and that truth lingered between them as the storm pressed harder against the windows. And for reasons she could not explain, Clara did not leave. She remained where she was, her hands still against the wood, her breath steadying in the presence she had sworn to avoid. And when the candles steadied at last, when the shadows retreated just enough to reveal the distance between them, she realized with quiet certainty that it was no longer as wide as it had been before, and worse than that, she was no longer entirely sure she wanted it to be. Morning arrived pale and quiet, the storm having passed, but leaving the world outside Whitmore Manor buried beneath a clean, blinding layer of snow that reflected the early light like glass. And Clara stood at the tall window in the east corridor, her fingers resting lightly against the cold pane as she watched the distant trees stand motionless under the weight of winter, telling herself that nothing had changed, that the night before had been nothing more than a moment of weakness she would not repeat. Yet the stillness felt different now, not empty but aware, as if the house itself had shifted in some subtle, irreversible way. And when footsteps sounded behind her, she did not turn immediately. She did not need to, because she already knew who it was, that quiet certainty settling into her before she could stop it. And when she finally faced him, her expression was composed, distant, exactly as it had always been. "Your Grace," she said evenly, but her voice lacked the sharp edge it once carried. And that absence did not go unnoticed, his gaze resting on her not with curiosity, but with a kind of patience that unsettled her more than any intrusion could have. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not as a barrier, but as something shared, something neither of them seemed in a hurry to break, until she stepped back deliberately, placing space where it belonged, her tone cooler now, controlled. "I trust you have matters more pressing than observing the weather." And there it was, the line redrawn, the distance restored, yet he did not retreat, did not challenge her either. He simply remained where he was, his presence steady as ever. "I do," he replied quietly, "and yet I am here." And something in those words lingered longer than it should have, because they were not an explanation, not an excuse, only a fact. And Clara felt it settle somewhere beneath her carefully constructed composure, unsettling in its simplicity. And so she turned away again, intending to leave, to end the moment before it could stretch into something she could not control. But as she passed him, close enough to feel the faint warmth of his presence against the cold air, her step faltered, just slightly, just enough for her breath to catch in a way she could not quite hide. And it was that small betrayal that changed everything, because he noticed, of course he noticed, not with a movement or a word, but in the way his stillness sharpened, his attention narrowing without closing the distance between them. And she hated that he saw it, hated that after all this time, after everything she had learned to bury, something as simple as proximity could still disrupt her so completely. And yet she did not move away faster. She did not correct it as she should have. Instead she paused, caught in that narrow space where leaving would have been the wiser choice, and staying felt like stepping into something unknown. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than she intended, almost unguarded. "You should not make this a habit." And this time, when he answered, there was something different beneath the quiet steadiness, something almost resolute. "Perhaps you should not either." And the words settled between them like a truth neither of them had meant to reveal. And for the first time since she had arrived at Whitmore Manor, Clara did not immediately retreat from it. She stood there, suspended in that fragile, dangerous stillness, aware that something had shifted beyond her control, and that no matter how carefully she rebuilt her distance, it would never again feel as absolute as it once had been. Days settled into a rhythm that Clara told herself she controlled. Yet it was no longer the same rhythm she had known before, because now there were moments she could not predict, small interruptions that slipped past her careful routines, and each one carried the same quiet certainty. He would be there, not always close, not always speaking, but present in a way that made absence feel impossible, and she began to notice it in ways she could not ignore. The sound of his footsteps that never rushed, the way conversations in the hall would soften when he entered, the subtle shift in the air that came with him, and though he never sought her out directly, never demanded her attention, it felt as though the space between them was slowly being redrawn without her consent, and that knowledge unsettled her more than she would ever admit. So she reinforced her boundaries. She spoke less, avoided longer corridors, kept her eyes lowered when necessary, and yet none of it stopped the inevitable. Because one afternoon, as the pale winter sun filtered through the tall windows of the library, she found herself alone among the quiet rows of books, her gloved fingers brushing along the spines as she searched for something to occupy her thoughts, something that required enough focus to silence the growing awareness she carried with her. And for a while it worked, until she sensed it again, that familiar presence behind her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the stillness shifted, and she did not turn immediately. She refused to give him that, but her breath slowed, her posture tightening ever so slightly, and when she finally faced him, her expression was composed, though her eyes held something sharper now, something almost weary. "Do you follow all your staff this way?" she asked, her tone controlled but edged with something deeper, something she could not quite conceal, and his response came as it always did, without hesitation, without apology. "No," he said simply, and the honesty of it left no room for dismissal, no space for her to pretend this was coincidence. And for a moment, that truth lingered between them, quiet and undeniable, and she felt it press against the walls she had built so carefully, testing them, searching for weakness, and she straightened slightly, drawing herself back into control. "Then I suggest you begin," she replied, turning away before he could answer. But this time, as she moved past him, her steps were not as steady as before, her composure not as effortless, and she hated that he could see it, hated that he did not look away from it, because there was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation, only that same quiet understanding that felt too close, too knowing. And when she reached the door, her hand resting against the handle, she paused, just briefly, caught between leaving and something far more dangerous. And it was in that pause that his voice came again, softer now, almost thoughtful. "You are not as unaffected as you wish to be." And the words struck deeper than she had prepared for, not because they accused, but because they were true. And she turned back then, her eyes meeting his fully for the first time since that night in the East Wing, her voice lower, steady but no longer entirely distant. "And you are not as indifferent as you pretend." And for a moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable, a recognition that neither of them had intended to allow. And it lingered there, fragile and dangerous, before she finally turned away and left the room, her steps echoing softly behind her. But this time, the distance she created did not feel like safety. It felt like something slipping beyond her control, something she could not quite bring herself to stop. The distance she placed between them should have been enough. It had always been enough before, but Whitmore Manor had a way of closing spaces without warning, of narrowing long corridors into moments that felt far too intimate, and Clara began to realize that avoidance was no longer a strategy she could rely on, because no matter where she turned, no matter how carefully she timed her movements, there were instances she could not predict, like the late afternoon when the sky dimmed early and the house settled into a hush that felt heavier than usual, and she found herself in the West Gallery, reviewing correspondence she did not truly see, her thoughts scattered in ways she refused to acknowledge, until that familiar stillness shifted again, and she did not need to look up to know he was there. She could feel it in the way her breath changed, in the way her hands stilled against the paper, and this time, she did not turn immediately. She let the silence stretch, testing it, as if daring it to break on its own. But it did not. It only deepened, until finally she set the letter aside and faced him, her composure intact but her patience thinner than before. "Is there something you require, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone measured, distant, and yet carrying the faintest trace of strain she could not fully conceal. And he regarded her in that same unhurried way, as though time did not press upon him as it did on everyone else. "No," he said simply, and the simplicity of it unsettled her more than any demand could have, because it meant he had come without reason, without necessity, and that was precisely what she could not allow. "Then I suggest you find something that does," she replied, sharper now, the edge returning to her voice as she attempted to reclaim control. But even as the words left her, she knew they lacked their former strength. And he seemed to recognize that as well, not with any visible reaction, but in the way he remained exactly where he was, unmoved, unbothered, and that stillness pressed against her defenses in a way she had not anticipated, because she was used to resistance, to opposition, to something she could push against. But this quiet refusal to retreat, left her with nothing to fight, and it made her uneasy in a way she could not define, and so she turned away again, intending to leave, to end the moment before it could unravel further. But as she passed him, something in her faltered, not a step, not a breath, something deeper, something she could not immediately name. And it was enough, just enough, for him to notice, and when his voice came, it was softer than before, lower, carrying a weight she had not heard until now. "You are tired," he said, not as a question, not as concern, but as fact, and the words struck her with a precision she was not prepared for, because they touched something she had kept hidden even from herself, and she stopped, her hand tightening slightly at her side, her back still turned to him as she forced her voice to remain steady. "That is none of your concern," she replied, but the response lacked conviction, and she knew it, and he knew it, and for a moment, the silence that followed was different. Not tense, not guarded, but something quieter, something closer to understanding, and it unsettled her more than anything else, because she could not remember the last time someone had seen through her so easily, without effort, without intrusion, simply by being there, and she did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to push it away without revealing more than she intended, and so she chose the only option left to her. She left, her steps measured but quicker than before, the distance between them closing behind her like a door she could not quite shut, and as she walked, she told herself it would end there, that she would restore the order she had always relied on, that she would not allow something as quiet as his presence to unsettle her so completely. But even as she reached the far end of the corridor, she felt it, that same awareness lingering just beneath the surface, the quiet certainty that no matter how far she went, he would not follow loudly. He would not demand, he would not chase, and that was precisely why he would not disappear that night. The manor fell into a deeper quiet than usual, the kind that settled into the bones of the house and lingered in every corridor, and Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small chamber, her hands folded too tightly over the blanket, as if stillness alone could hold her together. But it did not, because her thoughts refused to quiet. They circled back again and again to the same presence she had tried so carefully to avoid, to the way his voice had spoken without pressure, without demand, and how that had unsettled her more than any force ever could, and she turned onto her side with a quiet breath, closing her eyes as if that might be enough to restore the distance she had once relied on. But sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was shallow, fragile, the kind that broke too quickly, and sometime before dawn. She woke with a sharp inhale, her fingers tightening instinctively against the sheets as something from her past rose too close, too vivid, not a clear memory, never that, only the feeling of it, the loss of control, the silence that followed, the way she had learned to disappear within herself to survive it. And she sat up slowly, pressing her hand to her chest as she forced her breathing to steady, counting each inhale, each exhale, until the room returned to its quiet shape around her, until she could remind herself that she was no longer there, that nothing here could reach her, and yet the unease remained, lingering beneath her composure like something unresolved. And by the time morning light filtered faintly through the frost-covered glass, she had already decided, She would restore distance, completely this time. No hesitation, no exceptions, and she moved through the early hours with careful precision, keeping to the servants' corridors, avoiding the main hall, speaking only when required. Her voice controlled, her expression unreadable, and for a while it worked. The manor returned to its familiar quiet. The presence she had come to anticipate no longer appeared, and she told herself this was how it should be. This was what she wanted. And yet, as the day stretched on, something felt different. Not relief, not safety, but an absence she could not quite justify, and she refused to acknowledge it, focusing instead on her tasks, on the rhythm she had always trusted, until late afternoon drew long shadows across the stone floors, and she found herself in the garden once more. The cold air sharp against her skin as she stepped carefully along the frozen path, and for a moment she allowed herself to stop, to stand still beneath the pale sky, her breath visible in the quiet air, and it was there, in that stillness, that she felt it again, not behind her this time, not approaching, but already there, as if he had never truly left at all. And when she turned, he stood several feet away, no closer than before, no attempt to cross the distance she had so deliberately reestablished. And something in that restraint unsettled her more than his presence ever had. Because he had respected the boundaries she had drawn, he had given her exactly what she claimed to want, and yet it did not feel like victory. It felt like something quieter, something heavier, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them filled with something unspoken, something waiting, and when she finally broke the silence, her voice was softer than she intended, almost uncertain. "You did not come today," and the words lingered in the cold air between them, revealing more than she had meant, and for the first time, it was not him who had crossed the distance. It was her. The words lingered in the cold air longer than she intended, fragile and exposed in a way that made Clara immediately regret them, and she felt it, that subtle shift inside her chest, the quiet realization that she had crossed something invisible, something she had sworn never to approach. And for a moment she considered retreating, correcting herself, restoring the distance with the same practiced composure she had relied on for years. But it was too late, because he had already heard it, already understood, and when he answered, his voice was as steady as ever. "You asked me not to," he said, and there was no accusation in it, no challenge, only truth, and that truth pressed against her in a way she had not anticipated. Because he had listened, he had respected the boundaries she had drawn, and yet standing there now, she felt no relief from it. Only something quieter, something far more unsettling, and she lowered her gaze slightly, her breath visible in the cold air as she searched for something to say that would restore the balance she had lost. But nothing came, because anything she said now would reveal too much, and silence, for once, felt insufficient. And so she stood there, caught between the instinct to retreat and the unfamiliar pull to remain. And it was that hesitation, that single unguarded moment, that seemed to shift everything between them. Because he did not move closer, did not take advantage of it. He simply stayed where he was, allowing the distance to remain exactly as she had set it. And that restraint, that quiet refusal to cross the line, made it impossible for her to pretend this was something she needed to defend against. Because there was nothing to fight, nothing to resist, only a presence that did not demand, did not press, did not leave. And for the first time, Clara felt something she could not immediately name, not fear, not discomfort, but a kind of awareness that settled slowly, deliberately, as if it had always been there waiting for her to notice. And she drew a slow breath, steadying herself as she lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes, without the same sharpness she had used before. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter, more measured. "That does not mean you should disappear entirely." And the words felt strange even as she said them, unfamiliar, as though they belonged to someone else, someone she had not allowed herself to be in a very long time. And for a moment, something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, not surprise, not triumph, but recognition, as if he had been waiting for this without expecting it. And the silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer guarded. It was something else entirely, something that existed between them without needing to be defined, and Clara became aware of it in the smallest details, the way her shoulders no longer felt as rigid, the way her breath no longer caught so sharply in his presence, and it unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was not, because it felt dangerously close to something she had once believed impossible, and she turned away then, not abruptly, not in retreat, but with a quiet deliberation that carried a different kind of distance, one that no longer felt like a barrier, but something softer, something uncertain. And as she walked back toward the manor, she could feel it, that shift following her, not pressing, not chasing, simply there. And for the first time since she had arrived, Clara did not try to outrun it. She did not force herself to forget it. She allowed it to remain, small and undefined. And that was what made it the most dangerous of all. Because something that was not resisted had the quiet power to stay. The shift between them did not announce itself loudly, it settled in. Quietly, like the first hint of warmth beneath winter frost, subtle enough to ignore and yet impossible to entirely dismiss. And Clara carried it with her through the following days whether she wished to or not, finding it in the pauses she no longer rushed to fill, in the moments where silence felt less like a shield and more like something shared. And it unsettled her in ways she could not easily explain, because nothing had truly changed. He had not stepped closer, had not spoken more than necessary, had not asked anything of her, and yet everything felt altered, as if the space between them had begun to breathe on its own, and she truly tried to return to the certainty she once relied on, to rebuild the distance with the same precision that had protected her for so long. But something in her resistance had softened without her permission, and she noticed it in the smallest ways. The way her gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should when she found him in the same room. The way her voice no longer carried the same sharp edge when she addressed him. The way her steps slowed instead of quickened when she sensed his presence nearby. And each of these moments, small as they were, felt like a quiet betrayal of the control she had worked so hard to maintain. And it was in one of those moments, late in the evening when the manor had grown still and the corridors lay wrapped in dim candlelight, that everything shifted again, because she had not expected him there. In the narrow passage that led toward the west wing, a place rarely used, a place she had chosen precisely because it offered solitude. And yet he stood at the far end, not blocking her path, not approaching. Simply there, and she stopped before she could stop herself, her breath catching faintly as the familiar awareness settled over her. And for a second she considered turning back, choosing another route, restoring the distance in the only way she knew how. But something held her in place, something quiet and insistent, and instead of retreating, she moved forward, each step measured, deliberate, until the distance between them shortened to something neither of them acknowledged aloud. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, but softer than she intended. "You seem to appear where you are not expected." And there was no accusation in it this time, only observation, and his answer came just as quietly. "You seem to notice." And the words lingered between them, simple and undeniable, and Clara felt it again, that subtle shift beneath her composure, the awareness she had tried to ignore growing clearer, sharper, until it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or inconvenience. And she looked at him then, truly looked, not as the duke she served, not as the presence she avoided, but as the man who had remained when she had expected him to leave. And for a moment the world narrowed to that single, fragile space between them, filled with something unspoken yet unmistakable. And it frightened her, not because it threatened her, but because it did not, because it felt like something she had once wanted and no longer trusted. And she took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, her voice steady but quieter now. This should not continue. And the words were meant to restore the distance, meant to close whatever had begun to open. But even as she said them, she knew they lacked the conviction they once would have carried. And he seemed to understand that as well, because he did not move away, did not challenge her. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer before answering. "Then it will not." And something in that response unsettled her more than anything else he had said, because it was not resistance, not refusal, it was acceptance, and that acceptance left her with no argument, no reason to push him away. And as the silence returned, heavier now, filled with everything neither of them had spoken, Clara turned and continued down the corridor, her steps steady but slower than before. And for the first time, The distance she created did not feel like protection. It felt like something she might not be able to return to. The quiet acceptance of his words did not bring Clara the relief she had expected. It lingered instead like an unanswered question, one that followed her through the halls long after she had left that narrow corridor. And in the days that followed, she found herself listening for something she had once tried so carefully to avoid: the steady rhythm of his presence, the subtle shift in the air that signaled he was near. But it did not come, not as it had before, because he had kept his word. He did not appear where he was not expected. He did not remain where she might find him. And the manor returned to its earlier stillness, the kind that should have felt familiar, should have felt safe, and yet it did not. It felt emptier than before, as though something quiet had been removed, something she had not realized she had come to rely on, and she told herself this was what she wanted, this was the order she had chosen. And still, there were moments when her steps slowed without reason, when her gaze lingered at the far end of a corridor, as if expecting to see him there. And each time she found nothing, she forced herself to move on, to dismiss it as nothing more than habit, nothing more than the mind adjusting to change. But the absence remained, persistent and difficult to ignore, and it was on the fourth evening, as the sun set early behind heavy clouds and the manor settled into its dim, quiet rhythm, that she realized just how deeply that absence had settled, because she found herself in the garden again, standing where she had stood before, the cold air sharp against her skin, her breath visible in the fading light, and without thinking, she turned, expecting, and found only the empty path behind her, and something in her chest tightened, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to make her pause, enough to make her aware of what she had lost without meaning to, and she drew a slow breath, steadying herself, reminding herself that this was correct, this was how it should be. And yet her feet did not move. She remained where she was, caught in that quiet space between expectation and reality. And it was then, just as she was about to turn away, that she heard it, not footsteps approaching, not the familiar shift of presence drawing near, but something softer, something distant. The sound of his voice carried faintly through the open window of the west wing, and she stilled, listening without intending to, the low cadence of his words indistinct but unmistakable, and something about it drew her closer before she could stop herself, her steps slow, deliberate, until she reached the edge of the stone wall where the window stood slightly open, and she could see him then, not standing as he always had, not still and distant, but seated, his posture relaxed in a way she had never witnessed, his attention focused not outward but inward, as if for the first time he was not aware of being observed. And it changed something subtle but significant, because she realized then that the man she had come to know only in fragments existed beyond the quiet presence he had shown her. And for a moment she remained there, unseen, her breath held as she watched, not intruding, not revealing herself, simply observing. And in that moment, the distance between them felt different, not something imposed, not something chosen, but something fragile, something that could shift again without warning. And as she turned away at last, stepping back into the quiet of the garden, she carried that awareness with her, heavier now, clearer, and for the first time since she had insisted on distance, Clara understood something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that what she had pushed away had not disappeared, it had only stepped back, waiting in silence. Exactly as he always had. Clara did not sleep easily that night. The image of him lingering in her mind in a way she could not dismiss, not the distant, composed figure she had grown accustomed to, but the quieter version she had seen through the window, unaware, unguarded, and it unsettled her because it changed the shape of everything she thought she understood, because distance had always been simple when the other person remained a fixed idea, something defined and contained. But now that certainty had shifted, and with it, the fragile control she had relied on began to slip in ways she could not fully contain, and by morning, she had made a decision, one that felt both necessary and uncertain. She would not avoid him, not entirely, because avoidance had not brought her peace, it had only created a different kind of unrest, one that followed her even in his absence. And so she moved through the manor with a steadier rhythm, no longer altering her path to escape a presence that might not appear, no longer adjusting her time to avoid moments that might not come, And when she entered the main hall that afternoon and found him there, standing near the tall windows where winter light stretched pale across the floor, she did not stop, did not hesitate. She continued forward with quiet composure until she stood within a distance that felt deliberate rather than accidental. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence familiar now, but no longer sharp, no longer something she felt compelled to break. And when she finally lifted her gaze to meet his, her voice was calm, measured. "You have kept your distance," she said, not as accusation, not as relief, but as acknowledgement. And his response came with the same quiet steadiness she had come to expect. "You asked me to." And there it was again, that simple truth that left no room for argument, no space to hide behind misinterpretation. And Clara felt it settle between them, heavier now, because she understood what it meant. That his presence had never been imposed, never forced. It had been given, and just as easily withdrawn. And that realization stirred something deeper than she had anticipated, something that made her question the certainty she had clung to for so long. And she drew a slow breath, her gaze steady though something within her shifted. "And if I had not?" she asked quietly, the words leaving her before she could reconsider them. And for the first time, there was the faintest pause in him, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but something closer to consideration, as if he weighed the truth of his answer before offering it. "Then I would have remained," he said, and the simplicity of it struck her with a quiet force, because there was no condition in it, no expectation, no demand, only a statement of what he had already proven. And Clara felt it then, clearly, undeniably. The fragile line she had been walking, the distance she had tried to maintain no longer as solid as it once was. And, for a moment, she did not step back, did not retreat as instinct urged her to. She remained where she was, her breath steady but slower now, her thoughts no longer as controlled. And something in that stillness shifted, something unspoken yet understood, and she realized with a quiet certainty that the choice before her had changed. It was no longer simply about keeping distance or allowing closeness. It was about whether she would continue to pretend that what existed between them was something she could ignore. And as the light faded slightly across the floor, casting longer shadows between them, Clara held his gaze for a moment longer before turning away, not in retreat, not in avoidance, but in something quieter, something more deliberate. And though she did not look back, she knew, with a certainty that both unsettled and steadied her, that this time, if he remained, it would no longer be without her permission. The awareness did not fade after that moment in the hall. It deepened, settling into Clara's thoughts in a way that made it impossible to return to the careful detachment she had once mastered. Because now every step she took through Whitmore Manor carried a quiet recognition, not of him alone, but of the choice she had begun to acknowledge. And that knowledge changed the way she moved, the way she paused, even the way she listened to the silence that had once protected her. And in the days that followed, she no longer avoided him, but neither did she seek him out. Instead, there existed a delicate balance between them, something unspoken yet understood, where presence no longer felt like intrusion and absence no longer felt like relief. And it was within that fragile balance that the past began to stir more strongly than before, not because anything around her demanded it, but because something within her had shifted enough to allow it closer to the surface. And one evening, as the manor settled into its quiet rhythm and the last of the daylight faded from the windows, Clara found herself alone in the small sitting room near the east wing, a place she had once chosen for its isolation, its predictability. And she sat there with a book open in her hands, though she had not turned a page in several minutes, her gaze unfocused, her thoughts drifting somewhere she had not intended to follow. And when the memory came, it was not sudden, not sharp, it was gradual, creeping into her awareness like a shadow stretching across the floor, the echo of words once spoken, the weight of expectation she had not been able to escape, the quiet way she had learned to silence herself in order to endure it. And her fingers tightened slightly against the page as her breath slowed, the room around her growing distant in a way she recognized too well. And for a moment she remained still, suspended between the present and something she had spent years burying, until the sound of the door opening broke through the quiet, not loudly, not abruptly, but enough to pull her back. And she looked up, her expression composed out of habit even as her breath had not yet fully steadied. And there he was, standing at the threshold, not stepping further inside, not speaking immediately, simply present in the way he had always been, and something in that stillness grounded her in a way she had not expected. Because he did not ask what was wrong, did not demand explanation, he only remained. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but something steadier, something that allowed her to gather herself without feeling exposed. And when she finally lowered her gaze again, her voice came quieter than before, stripped of its usual distance. "You should not be here," she said, though the words lacked their former insistence. And his response came just as quietly, "Then ask me to leave." And the simplicity of it settled between them with a weight she could not ignore, because this time, the choice was not implied. It was clear, and Clara felt it then, unmistakably. The moment suspended before her, the instinct to retreat rising as it always had, urging her to restore the distance, to reclaim the safety she had built. And yet beneath that instinct was something else, something quieter but stronger, something that had grown in the spaces she had allowed to remain. And she drew a slow breath, her fingers relaxing slightly against the book as she lifted her gaze once more, meeting his eyes not with resistance, not with guarded distance, but with something uncertain, something real. And for a moment she said nothing. She did not ask him to leave. She did not step away. She simply remained where she was. And in that silence, the choice was made without words, because for the first time, Clara Bennett did not close the door she had spent so long keeping shut. She left it open. Even if only just enough for him to stay, the door remained open, not wide, not inviting, but enough. And that small, deliberate absence of refusal changed the air in the room in a way Clara could not ignore. Because for the first time, his presence was not something she endured or resisted. It was something she allowed, even if she did not yet understand why. And Alexander did not move immediately. He did not cross the threshold as though claiming the space. He stepped forward only after a quiet pause, measured, respectful of the distance she had not entirely erased. And when he stopped a few feet from her, the silence between them felt different from before, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, as if something fragile had settled into place without needing to be named. And Clara became acutely aware of it, of the way her breath remained even, of the way her hands no longer tightened defensively around the book resting in her lap. And it unsettled her because it was unfamiliar, because it felt like the absence of something she had relied on for too long. And she lowered her gaze briefly, gathering herself. Though this time it was not to retreat, it was to understand. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had ever been in his presence. "You do not ask questions," she said, not as criticism, not as expectation, but as observation. And his answer came without hesitation, calm, grounded. "You have not offered answers." And there was no tension in the exchange, no edge to the words, only truth. And Clara felt it settle within her, not as something to defend against, but as something to consider, because he had never pushed, never demanded, he had only remained. And that constancy, that quiet restraint, had done what force never could. It had made her aware of herself in ways she had long avoided. And for a moment she said nothing, her thoughts moving slowly, deliberately, as she looked down at the page she had not read, at the steady rise and fall of her own breath, at the quiet space that no longer felt like something she needed to protect. And when she finally lifted her gaze again, there was something different in it, something unguarded, though not entirely open, something that existed between hesitation and trust. And she spoke again, her voice softer, almost reflective. There was a time when silence was the only way to remain unseen. And the words lingered in the air between them, fragile but clear, and it was the closest she had come to speaking of anything beyond the present, the closest she had come to allowing him to see even a fragment of what she had carried. And he did not respond immediately, did not fill the space with unnecessary words. He only held her gaze with that same steady awareness. And when he finally spoke, it was quiet, deliberate. "And now," he said, not as a question, but as an opening. And Clara felt it then, the weight of that moment, the choice it carried. Because she could retreat, she could close the door she had only just opened. She could return to the safety of silence that had defined her for so long. And yet something within her resisted that instinct, something that had grown slowly, quietly. In every moment he had remained without asking for more, and she drew a slow breath, her fingers loosening slightly around the book before she set it aside. A small, deliberate action that felt far more significant than it should have. And when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, though still quiet. Now I am learning that silence is not the same as safety. And the admission settled between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but deeply real. And for a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. And in that stillness, Clara realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that the space she had once feared could hold something other than pain, something that did not demand, did not take, did not force, something that simply existed and waited. And for the first time, she did not turn away from it. She remained where she was, allowing the quiet to stay, allowing him to stay. And though nothing had been promised, nothing had been defined, it was enough, more than enough, because it was real, and it was hers to choose. The silence did not break. It settled, deep and steady, as if the room itself had come to rest around them. And Clara remained where she was, aware of every small detail in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in years, the quiet rhythm of her own breath, the stillness of her hands now resting lightly against her lap, the presence of him not as something she needed to guard against, but something that existed without demand. And it was that absence of pressure that made everything else possible, because nothing in this moment required her to be anything other than what she was. And that realization moved through her slowly, not as a sudden change, but as a quiet unfolding, something that had begun long before she had recognized it. And for a moment, she simply stood there, letting it settle, letting the silence hold what words did not need to carry. And when she finally moved, it was not to retreat, not to restore distance, but to close the space between them just enough to acknowledge what had already shifted, her steps measured, deliberate, until she stood within reach, though she did not cross that final line. Not yet. And she lifted her gaze to meet his, not guarded, not distant, but steady in a way that felt entirely new. And there was something in his expression, something quiet and certain, as though he had understood this moment long before it arrived. And for the first time, Clara did not question it. She did not resist it. She allowed it to exist. And in that stillness, something within her eased, not completely, not all at once, but enough to remind her that she no longer needed to hold everything so tightly. And her hand moved then, not quickly, not with hesitation, but with a quiet intention she could not fully explain, until her fingers came to rest lightly against his, not grasping, not seeking reassurance, simply there, a small, undeniable connection that carried more meaning than anything she could have said. And she felt it immediately, not a rush, not a sudden change, but a steadiness that grounded her in a way she had not expected. And she did not pull away. She did not retreat into the distance she had once relied on. She remained, allowing that single point of contact to exist without fear, without the need to define it. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, steady, no longer shaped by the need to protect herself from something that was not there. You stayed, she said, not as a question, not as surprise, but as recognition. And his answer came just as quietly, just as certain. You allowed it. And the words settled between them, simple and complete, because they held the truth of everything that had changed, not through force, not through insistence, but through something far quieter, something chosen. And Clara felt it then, clearly, the difference between what she had once feared and what now stood before her. Because this was not something that demanded to be felt, it was something that waited until she was ready to feel it. And that made all the difference. And she drew a slow breath, her fingers still resting lightly against his, not tightening, not pulling away, simply staying. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future did not feel like something she needed to brace against. It felt uncertain, yes, but not in a way that threatened her, in a way that invited her, quietly, patiently, to step forward when she chose to. And she did not know what would come next. She did not know how far this fragile beginning would carry. But for once, she did not need to know, because she had already done the hardest thing, She had not turned away, and sometimes that was where everything began, not in grand declarations, not in promises spoken aloud, but in the quiet moment when someone who had once learned to disappear chose instead to remain, and allowed another to remain with her.